The most terrifying story you will ever read. That was what the cover promised me, in bold red lettering against a featureless black backdrop. Curious, I turned the book over to the back to check the synopsis. There was none. The back cover was completely blank. I stood there, in the paperback horror section of the used bookstore I had entered after work on a whim, frowning, bemused at the book I had grabbed off the shelf at random. Apart from what I assumed was the title, the most terrifying story you will ever read, and a $4.99 price tag on the upper right corner, both the front and the back of the paperback were unmarked in any way. There wasn't even an author credited, or any publishing company info. I opened it to the front page to see if that would answer my queries. No help there. There was no author listed inside the book either, and no copyright page. No critical blurbs, no dedication, nothing. Now I was really intrigued. I fanned rapidly through the book to the last page, noting that there didn't seem to be any chapter breaks or part divisions in the story, whatever it was about. The author wasn't listed on the heading of the pages either, just the page numbers. I opened it to the last page, not bothering to read the text, and saw it was just over 350 pages long. The book appeared to be brand new, the pages clean white, the binding unmarred by lines, the ink still bright and clear. This struck me as especially strange because the book was also lacking a UPC on the rear cover, which all modern books have. I took out my phone and did a quick search for the title on Google. No results. Okay. I wondered if this was some sort of marketing ploy on the part of the mysterious author in an effort to spark interest. Or maybe it was some weird, obscure, self-published novel. Whatever it was, I was hooked. I had to know what this story was about. I wasn't much of a reader by nature, but this was an enigma I had to solve. Otherwise, the curiosity would drive me nuts. Plus, it was the weekend and I didn't have anything else planned. Reading this book was as good a way as any to fill in the lonely void my existence had become since Rachel had left. I took the paperback to the front counter where the clerk, a bored-looking teenage girl with spiked purple hair, stood, chewing gum. She rang up my purchase without comment, hardly even looking up from the YouTube video she was watching on her phone. I asked her if she knew anything about the book, and she just shrugged disinterestedly. I thanked her and left the bookstore, heading down the sidewalk to the subway entrance a couple blocks up the street. I took the subway across the city to the street where my apartment complex stood. I was tempted to start reading the book on the subway, but restrained myself. The subway ride was only 20 minutes, and I didn't want to become engrossed in the story, assuming it was any good, only to have to break off when I arrived at my stop. Back at my building, I took the elevator up to my apartment on the 17th floor and unlocked my door, entering and cringing by habit when I saw the depressing bachelor squalor of my place. I had been too depressed to do much cleaning in the 3 months since Rachel had broken up with me. Piles of dirty laundry were scattered everywhere, and discarded takeout wrappers, I'm not much of a cook, and empty beer bottles cluttered every available surface. I would have to pick up this mess one of these days, before my apartment turned into a landfill. I had a quick dinner of some leftover pizza, then plopped down on the sofa. I glanced out the window. Late afternoon had given way to early evening, and the sun was already setting over the city. I turned off my phone, not wanting any unnecessary interruptions, not that I get many calls anyway, and picked up the book. The most terrifying story you will ever read. I smirked. Let's see if it delivered on that promised. I opened it to the first page, read the first few lines, and suddenly felt numb. John pulled the paperback from its shelf in the horror fiction section of the used bookstore he had entered after work on a whim, and glanced at its front cover. "The most terrifying story you will ever read," the title read in bold red lettering against a featureless black backdrop. Curious, John turned the book over to the back cover to read the synopsis. There was none. The back was completely blank. I closed the book and sat back, closing my eyes tightly, trying to calm my suddenly racing heart. It's just a coincidence, I tried to rationalize to myself. It has to be a coincidence. John was probably the most common name in the world. I opened the book again and read on. John opened the book to the front page to see if that would answer his queries. There was no author listed inside the book, no copyright page, no dedication. John fanned rapidly through the book to the last page, noting there didn't appear to be any chapter breaks or part divisions in the story, whatever it was about. The author wasn't listed on the headings of the pages either, just the page numbers. I felt an eerie ripple of déjà vu. It's still just a coincidence, part of my mind tried to argue unconvincingly. I continued to read. John was intrigued. He took out his phone and did a Google search for the book's title. There were no results. Hell, anyone would do that in that situation, my mind offered hopefully. I read the next few paragraphs. Then reality seemed to float away. John decided to purchase the book. He wasn't much of a reader by nature, but this was an enigma he had to solve. Otherwise, the curiosity would drive him crazy. Besides, it was the weekend, and he didn't have anything else planned. Reading this book was as good a way as any to fill in the lonely void his existence had become ever since Rachel had left. He took the book to the front counter, where the clerk, a bored-looking teenage girl with spiked purple hair, stood, chewing gum. She rang up his purchase without comment, hardly even looking up from the YouTube video she was watching on her phone. "Do you know anything about this book?" John asked her. She only shrugged disinterestedly. I felt like I was having an out-of-body experience, as if my consciousness had left my body and was hovering above me. My mind felt dazed, drugged. This couldn't be really happening. It had to be a prank of some kind, a practical joke. Someone had planted this book for me to find. Maybe it was one of the guys from my work, or an employee at the bookstore. Maybe even Rachel or one of her friends. Except I had passed by that bookstore hundreds of times on my way to and back from work for the past 3 years, and had never entered it before this afternoon. I had only gone in there today on a fluke, and had grabbed this book off the shelf by sheer chance. "Stop reading it right now," a desperate, frightened inner voice urged me. "Throw the book away. Burn it. Stop now before it's too late." But something told me it already was too late. Had been from the moment I'd first picked this book up. I couldn't go back. Could only go forward. I had to know what happened next. I continued reading, seemingly not of my own accord. I read through my trip home on the subway. I read through me entering my apartment. I read through my shocking discovery of how this book somehow exactly mirrored my life, down to the finest detail, every action and thought and emotion. John read through his shocking discovery of how the book somehow exactly mirrored his life, down to the finest detail, every action and thought and emotion. Suddenly there came a sound, breaking the silence and startling him. A soft knocking at his apartment door. There was a sudden sound that broke the silence, startling me. A soft knock at my apartment door. I jumped, my heart pounding. All the saliva seemed to have dried up in my mouth. The knocking continued. Slow, spaced, and steady raps on my door. Soft but persistent. Still clutching the book tightly in one hand, I stood up, as if in a dream, and approached my apartment door. A sudden, irrational feeling of unease settling over me. It could be anyone. My landlord, a solicitor, maybe Rachel coming back for a second chance. I peered through the glass peephole in the center of the door. I bit down on a scream of horror. The face on the other side of my door belonged to an elderly woman. Her hair was long, ragged, and filthy. Her face was marred with hideous, ragged gashes, crusted with dried blood. Her skin was gray and rotting, peeling away from her skull. Her eyes were blank and white, without pupils or irises. It was the face of a corpse. I staggered back from my door, my mind reeling. I felt like I was in the grip of a nightmare. Too late, I realized I had forgotten to lock my apartment door when I had gotten back. I reached forward to turn the deadbolt, but the knob was already turning. I watched, petrified, as my door slowly opened. She stood before me, only 5 feet away, staring at me with her unblinking dead eyes. Her clothing was torn and hideous. Oozing wounds covered her body. She reeked of death.
"Get out,"
she gurgled at me, her voice a putrid death rattle. She lurched a step toward me, repeating in a louder voice,
"Get out."
She raised one hand, reaching in my direction. I snapped out of my paralysis and turned, sprinting in a blind panic through my apartment to my bedroom. I slammed the door and locked it, backing away, gasping. I turned to my window and saw it was now fully dark outside. I started for it, then remembered I was 17 floors up, and there were no ledges around the exterior of the building. I searched for my phone, then realized with cold dread I had left it on the table in the living room, and there was no landline. I became aware that I still had the paperback gripped tightly in one hand. I heard a sudden sound that caused my heart to jump in my chest. Creaking floorboards. Footsteps slowly approaching my bedroom. They stopped on the other side of the door. The knob rattled as the thing turned it.
"Get out."
The rancid voice demanded through the door.
"Get out."
The book. The goddamn book. Maybe the answer was in there. I opened it and frantically flipped through the pages to where I had left off. Suddenly there came a sound, breaking the silence and startling him. A soft knocking at his apartment door. John jumped, his heart pounding. All the saliva seemed to have dried up in his mouth. I skimmed through the action that had already happened until I reached the present, with John, me, trapped in my bedroom.
"Get out,"
the rancid voice demanded through the door.
"Get out."
In desperation, John opened the book and frantically flipped through the pages to where he had left off, thinking the answer might be in there. To his disbelief, the rest of the pages were blank. "No!" John's terrified mind screamed. "It's impossible. The story ran all the way to the last page when I checked it at the bookstore. How?" There, the story ended. The rest of the pages were blank. I flipped through the book with disbelief, my terrified mind screaming, "It's impossible. The story ran all the way to the last page when I checked it at the bookstore. How?" The dead woman spoke a final time from the other side of the door, and only then, too late, did I detect the tone of urgency and fear in her decayed voice. Not a threat, but a desperate plea.
"Get out. Get out while you still can. It's in the closet. Get out before it kills you, like it killed me."
Behind me, I heard my closet door creak open. Hey guys and ladies, thanks for watching. Links to all my shit are down in the description. Merch, Patreon, social media, Discord. That was The Most Terrifying Story You Will Ever Read by CarlB1961. There's a plug for his Patreon down in the description too. So that's about it. Be good to animals, even people. See ya.
Ja, snälla, bärksbes, hörs.